good to stretch the legs and just to connect a little bit. I'm going to ask those folks that are still making their way to just come on in as we proceed with our next session. With a market capitalization of over $1 trillion, over 2 billion in trading volumes daily, and over 400 companies, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is not only the largest in Africa, but certainly one of the oldest in the world. I think it was established in 1887. Here is a recorded message from its fearless leader, Leila Fourie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so sorry that I'm unable to be there in person, but I'm sure that you're going to walk away from the conference inspired with the great opportunities that the continent has to offer. I'd like to start by acknowledging and commending Sim Shabalala and Bill Blackie for the tremendous contribution that they and their teams are making towards the growth on the African continent. Small and medium enterprises are the backbone of Africa and the growth node for the future. This conference takes place at such an opportune time after our elections in South Africa as we embark on a new political journey as a country, and it's so important that we've come together not just as attendees of this critical dialogue, but as custodians of our country and the continent's potential. The dialogue about Africa's potential is ongoing, and in many ways, that potential continues to be unlocked through many innovations coming from the continent. While some speak of our rich mineral resources, energy, or the historical heritage, the true revelation lies in the promised potential and boundless opportunities that our diverse continent holds. At the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, we are proud to actively invest in key products and services to transform this promise into a tangible reality. The JSE continues to provide market participants with access to the continent through counters listed on the JSE, with operations on the continent across a vast representation of industries. This commitment is further reflected in our dual listing offering, which serves as an opportune gateway for African investors to experience a more diverse range of investments while enhancing liquidity and boosting market activity. From South Africa, we've worked strategically with our partners across the continent to help develop our African capital markets, and we look forward to unlocking that full potential. With Africa set to have a growing population that will far surpass that of the global growth rate, we do see an opportunity to target a new, different, and diverse type of investor and customer. We remain responsive to what capital markets can bring to a broader profile of individuals as the continent continues to grow. In closing, at the JSE, we are really proud champions of creating an enabling environment for the prosperity of African markets. We're dedicated to continuing to play our part to deliver a comprehensive products set, services and solutions to cater for the ever-evolving needs of our capital markets. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the conference.
With that said then, folks, up next we have yet another panel discussion, Growing Together in a Fragmented World. Tunde Macaulay is the Head of Business and Commercial Banking Africa and Offshore here at Standard Bank Group. He'll moderate this session and he'll also introduce his panelists. Please let me hand over to Tunde Macaulay.
Thank you, Bongani. Good morning. Trust you're all still enjoying the conference. Let me give a bit of a background to fragmentation, because when this topic first came up, it sounds like an English word. So I'll take, leaning from Goolam's previous slide. Now, if you look at the global world, political tensions are causing all sorts of fragmentation in terms of trade tariffs, technology decoupling, migration, and all these problems globally. In fact, I was reading an IMF blog yesterday, and the IMF estimates that between 2019 and now, there's been 3,000 more trade tariff barriers across the globe. And this has costs. The IMF estimates that about 7.4% of global output will be reduced just from fragmentation. And that's about $7.5 trillion, the combined economies of France and Germany. So it's a big problem. Now, the fragmentation is not just globally. We've also got market fragmentation across Africa. Supply chain challenges, intra-Africa trade, and so on and so forth. And that's what the African Continental Free Trade Area or agreements, whichever one you choose, is trying to solve. The estimation is that by 2050, 50% of Africa's trade will be within itself. Today, only 2 blocks have made good progress. East Africa, we spoke about it earlier on, 25% of its trade is within itself. SADC, 23%. ECOWAS lags behind, about 14%. So there's lots of work to be done around this fragmentation. However, within these markets, we've got entrepreneurs still succeeding. So the purpose of this session is to hear from them. How have they survived? How have they run their businesses in this fragmented world? How have banks supported them, and how can banks support entrepreneurs? And then how does collaboration and integration across the different countries enable this growth? So that's the purpose of this panel. And to join me on this panel, I would like to, first of all, introduce Bob Henson. Bob is the managing director of Driptech. Driptech is a company that was started in Workington in 1995. Under his leadership, they're involved in agricultural irrigation. Remember, Goolam talked about irrigation and the challenges with water and all that. So under his leadership, there's been significant growth. They've diversified. It's now a $36 million company. And the company has now diversified beyond agricultural irrigation into water supply and mine drainage. So we look forward to Bob telling us his story from Zimbabwe. I'd like us to give Bob a round of applause. Bob, please join. The second entrepreneur is Howard. Howard is the non-executive chairman of number 2 Piggeries. He's got extensive expertise in agric. As he told me in the green room, he's just a coordinator. The experts are in the company. But he's, anyway, nonetheless, an expert in agric and business management. Howard is recognized for his strategic vision and commitment to sustainable farming. And let me tell you a bit about number 2 Piggeries that Howard leads. They employ 1,600 employees, 3.2 billion in turnover, 30 years experience, 79,000 tons of pork annually. They produce 250,000 liters of milk daily, and 40% of this milk is processed into cheese and butter. So when Howard comes in, he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the agric sector. So please join me in welcoming Howard. I'd like to also invite Simon. Simon is the CEO of Grupo Naval. Grupo Naval is a diversified group in hospitality, real estate, food production, supply chain management, and construction, amongst others. The group was founded in 2000 in Eritrea with operations in 8 different markets. Today, Grupo Naval's annual turnover is $420 million, producing approximately 350,000 tons of food in Africa. They've invested so far $300 million in infrastructure to support their businesses, and they've got 400,000 metric tons traded globally. In Angola, they're forced to reckon with in the agro-industry area. So please join me in welcoming Simon. Simon, come up to the stage. Thanks. And last but not the least, our own dear Goolam, who needs no further introduction. Goolam, please join me. So I try to paint a non-economist view of fragmentation. Now I'll go to the technical part of it. So Goolam, let's start with you. The first question is, what are the primary socio-economic, political, and cultural factors that contribute to this fragmentation that I've talked about across Africa?
Good morning again. I'm a little surprised because I was supposed to be the fourth panelist to be addressed, and I didn't have time to conjure up an answer. So I presented a slide a little earlier on, which I think I can partly reference. And it's this multiplicity of factors that's creating angst. It's creating societal dislocation. And just to use one anecdote, survey data in Western nations show that more than half of the youth actually prefer big men leaders. They prefer these leaders who are emerging on the flurry of populism because they are disenamored with the current crop of leaders that, through the eyes of the youth, have destroyed their climate. And the youth are also insecure because of the technological shifts that could render them unemployed, not just cyclically, occasionally, but structurally as well. So rather than relayering those sort of top-down themes that I spoke about earlier on, address it from the ground up, from the trenches, and just to suggest where I think a lot of this dislocation is stemming from in terms of its roots. And of course, when you have this dislocation, it, in a sense, forces politicians to turn inward. And to also play on an illustration that I rendered earlier on. And I celebrated former President Lula, when I say former, in his first iteration. He was then replaced by Dilma Rousseff. And because of Brazil's instability, because of her turning inwards to create a level of calm, not too successful, but the point of turning inward in terms of political focus, the Brazil-Africa Accord was neglected. And from $3 billion to $30 billion during former President Lula's era, first term, Brazil stuttered. And again, there's an anecdote of what happens when the political focus lowers its gaze internally. So I think in many markets around the world, politics is turning inward. The incentives in terms of globalization and trade and external focus is suffering some level of diminished spirits. And I'll conclude just by saying, if we look at the United States, it appears that the world's largest economy has never been as polarized in terms of the Republican and Democratic ideology, and to the neglect of America's prosperity and its role in the world. So perhaps a multiplicity of forces at its root, quite simply, insecurity on the ground, especially from a mushrooming youth across the world, in emerging markets as well, and misdirected political focus.
Thanks, Goolam. Let me try and practicalize it with the entrepreneurs. Bob, in the 29 years your business has been operating, can you share with us instances where you've had to pivot your business due to market fragmentation? And what strategies did you implement in response to this?
Thank you. Well, I was a farmer, and I lost my farm, and I had to start again. So that was the first pivot that we made. While I was farming, I developed a system of irrigation that was more appropriate to our cost of production, and it enabled massive water saving, and it was affordable. And I started the company Driptech while I was actually farming. After leaving farming, I went mining whilst keeping the irrigation company going. The irrigation company went very quiet because farming actually almost came to a stop during that period of 10 to 15 years. The opportunity then was that there was a large market in the urban areas where the councils and other amenity providers were failing to provide water sustainably into the town. So we saw an opportunity there to develop that market. We started making what South Africans call jumbo tanks. We started manufacturing PVC piping to be able to conduit the water around the cities. And then we developed products that suited just the urban residential type of individual. Subsequently, Zimbabwe's agriculture has been picking up, and we've further pivoted into other areas of service, namely solar energy. We're large suppliers of solar energy now. Electricity is extremely expensive in Zimbabwe, so a solar system can almost pay itself off in less than 18 months, and then from then onwards your power is for free. So we've changed a lot in that respect. We've also created branches right across the main city of Harare. We've got 7 branches, just to enable the convenience of people being able to. Harare's traffic is busy, so we've seen an opportunity there, and that's given us quite an advantage. We've also come up with packages, where credit type packages for farmers to be able to get them going and provide expertise. We've spent a lot of time and effort in creating a brand and developing within the community so that we have a good standing within the community. So our product is well known, the company is well thought of, and we've been growing consistently for 10 years now at a rate of 25% a year. My family, my boys, I've got 3 boys, they came and joined me 10 years ago, and they've been pivotal in making the companies grow, the various companies. Peter, my son, is here with me today. He's our middle son, and he runs Driptech Irrigation.
Thank you very much. That's a very good story of how you've been able to navigate some of the fragmentation we've seen. Simon, let me come to you. Grupo Naval has grown significantly in the past few years, despite operating in a fragmented industry, especially in Angola. Can you share key factors behind the success of Grupo Naval?
First of all, thank you for the opportunity. As mentioned before, Angola has been seeing a lot of challenge, as mentioned by the chief economist. One of the strategies, there's a lot of strategies that we followed, but I will focus just on 2, and one of it was the diversification. As mentioned on the introduction, we have diversified our business into different sectors, and this is to mitigate the fluctuation of the market. Secondly is focus on vertical integration. So the group, focusing on Angola now, the group was a trader in food and non-food, and now we can say we are one of the main players when it comes to manufacturing. And it's not a rocket science what we've done. Basically, we just decided to produce the goods that we were trading, importing locally, fully transformation or partially. A lot of challenge, but that was the 2, I would say. I would stress on those 2 strategies that helped us go through this challenging period.
So in the earlier panel, Priscilla challenged the banks and talked about the bank's being innovative around supporting entrepreneurs. How has the banking sector helped you in this strategy?
How long time do I have? I remember in end of 2019 when we decided to move in this transformation, focus on industry, manufacturing. Tunde visited us in, I believe it was around August, September. And we were just showing him the sites that we started. It was basics. We had steel structures, not much happening. And he asked me a question. He said, so how do you do those investments? And I told him, through our own funds, traditional way. He said, we will support you, we will finance you, and we will show you how to do investments in the future. And he did that in 3 months. I'm not speaking because he's here, but in 3 months we've had a finance. I would like to stress out that, okay, the group was doing okay, great, with good growth, but it wouldn't be where it is today without the support of the bank. The bank not only provides funding, but also support in networking in other markets where we're trying to export other goods. Recently, we've been talking about opening accounts in the offshores, where there's a lot of challenge from being accepted LCs from Angola and other countries. There's a lot of support that we've been receiving. But there's one thing I always say, that the threat is that the bank knows our business A to Z, knows everything. If the bank one day decides, I say that to Tunde sometimes, if the bank decides to invest in similar business, I think we will have a serious competition.
Thanks, Simon. Howard, number 2 Piggeries has 34 facilities across South Africa, and I believe 4 in Namibia, and your business is very diversified. Piggeries, abattoir, dairy farm, crop, beef. How have you been able to embed operational efficiencies given these complexities across the different markets?
Sorry, just repeat the last bit.
How have you been able to embed the operational efficiencies across the different markets?
Yeah. So this business started in the late 70s, early 80s, and it started as one big farm. And as you've mentioned, it's grown rapidly over the years into being pig and dairy farming and multiple pig farms. What the business started doing some years ago, in order to ensure operational efficiency, was to start building very large piggeries. It used to be a whole lot of small pig farms scattered around mostly the Eastern and Western Cape. But some years ago they embarked on building pig farms, and when I say large pig farms, we're talking about a farm which would have about 5,000 sows and in total about 60,000 pigs on one farm. There are now 4 such pig farms in the number 2 Piggeries business. 2 here in the Western Cape near Malmesbury, 1 in the Eastern Cape, and 1 in KwaZulu-Natal. So those require massive investments to be made, but if one looks at the efficiency, all the metrics that pig farmers would measure, if one looks at the efficiency of those farms, they are far more efficient than the smaller units. And in times where you have challenging trading environment, as we have had, where pork prices are depressed and feed prices are very high, it's important that you have that efficiency. One of the other things that they realized a long time ago, and I must emphasize when I say they, I'm an independent non-executive on the board, and as I mentioned in the briefing room, I don't consider myself an agricultural expert. I've learned a lot in the last 7 years, but people I work with don't need me to be an agricultural expert. They've forgotten more about farming than I'll ever learn. So they are the experts, and what they realized some time ago was that there's an opportunity when it comes to pig and dairy farming. A lot of dairy farms provide their milk to cheese factories, and the waste from cheese factories is the product whey. W-H-E-Y, it's a high protein product, and it's actually a problem for the cheese factories. They've got to dispose of their whey. And the number 2 Piggeries started negotiating with some cheese factories to say, we'll solve your problem, you pump the whey to us, and you don't charge us for the whey, and you also don't have a cost of disposal. And the whey is a very high protein feed for the pigs. So that was another way of, pardon the expression, it was another method of providing very cost-effective feed to the piggeries. So those are a couple of the things they've done.
No, thank you very much, Howard. Goolam, let me pivot back to you. We've heard from the business folks, the practical aspects of how they've run their businesses. How do these fragmented conditions affect the operational strategies and growth prospects of businesses operating within Africa?
On a lighter note, if I may just say, I came across a statistic once upon a time. At any point in time in China, there is a stock of 200 million pigs catering for local consumption. That's 3.5 times South Africa's population. Talk about scale. So when economists, as we do, think about operational efficiencies, we tend to think about it through the lens of network industries. And now there's another seemingly fanciful term. So it speaks to the utilities, electricity generation at affordable rates, logistics, and, excuse me, access to, for example, water resources. Many African countries suffer, as we do know well, from gross power shortage. This has been an endeavor that has been threatening for several decades. That said, on the positive side, the renewable energy frontier market in recent years has increased the capacity for amplifying access to power in markets where the grid is absent. Many African countries suffer from grid absence, whether it is power or banking, for example, where clearly there isn't an abundance of branch networks. But we're going through a process of leapfrogging, where banks are able, financial services firms, I should say, are able to distribute services via digital waves, which is precisely why Africa now has more than 900 million mobile telephony users, having leapfrog fixed-line telephony, because we were not burdened with fixed-line telephony that needed to be serviced and could deploy mobile telephony. So, at least with respect to power, the renewable energy process is amplifying access to power. But of course, it's a little bit more difficult with regard to logistics. But my sense is that the African free trade theme is galvanizing thinking surrounding these nodes, these transport corridors, linking markets, which is tectonic and powerfully catalytic in terms of amplifying scale with respect to whether it's agriculture or more industrial goods. So ultimately the bedrock, at least through an economist lens, is that greater investment in these network industries provides the capacity for entrepreneurs to be able to then fashion business propositions around lower costs, which is critical, lower costs with regard to their overhead structures with respect to these utilities, and give greater commercial vitality. You also mentioned East Africa, I think, at the outset. East Africa has somewhat comparative advantage because it's already fairly integrated. We've heard that 45% of East Africa's trade is with itself, which is more than 3 times or around 3 times the rest of the Africa's intra-trade. But it speaks to that legal integration, logistics integration, already the existence of firms that trade across the region and therefore have their umbilical cords. So network industries for me is a critical input, and it's where Africa lacks. The one image I didn't show at the outset with respect to Africa is African roads. And we have the map. But if you look at Africa roads, you will notice that it's quite depleted in terms of a stock of capital in many places. And as they continue to roll out, and they are being rolled out, so too I think that those operational capacities for firms will begin to increase.
Thanks, Goolam. I got asked a question that I couldn't answer, so I'm going to ask you. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot. The ambition of integration across Africa, especially with the Africa Continental Trade-Free Area Agreement of 50% trade within itself by 2050, is it realistic, and why? And what do you think the effect of integration would be?
It's ambitious. I think it's plausible ambition. And I think it is the private sector that is going to be critical in delivering that. I think there's an increased recognition that it is not the promise of a nation state, but the economic promise of cities. So the economics of the city-state and urbanization trends is leading a lot of entrepreneurs to recognize that they focus on these urban areas, and there's some negative connotation with respect to rural neglect, but for the moment. So focus on cities and peri-urban districts and the economic opportunity in those hubs, combined with near-city connection. I'll just use an anecdote because I think many will be familiar with South Africa. The manner in which Midrand has connected Johannesburg and Tshwane, Alexandria and Cairo, Accra and Lagos. So I think city to city and across borders and sometimes, abundantly within countries is growing. And city economics combined with these trading nodes will be the growth locomotive for the African trade's ambitions, even though it's a political project with substantial ministerial endeavor, and of course, policies with regard to lowering tariff and non-tariff barriers. But the private sector combined with public infrastructure, I think this is going to be a significant growth endeavor over the next 2 to 3 decades, making interregional trade more promising. The last point I'll make very quickly is, last 30 years, the IMF Washington consensus pushed for open borders. It pushed for this liberalized trade. And many nations have realized at the same time that Africa perhaps liberalized too quickly and have therefore had to suffer deindustrialization because of the threat of manufacturing flaws in other markets. And now public policy that is dictating local production. Industrialization strategies are coming back in vogue. Danny Roderick and other thinkers, our own Ibrahim Patel, despite many people disparaging him, had this notion of reindustrializing Africa. So industrialization strategies are sexy, again, and to some degree serving to shield local industry within reason to find the capacity to show traction.
Thanks, Goolam. Let me come back to the practical experts. Howard, given what we've all discussed on the rapidly evolving dynamics across the different markets and customer segments, could you discuss your experience in navigating these complexities of fragmented markets and some of the things that Goolam has talked about, road connections, etc., and all that. It'd be good to get your thoughts on that.
So perhaps I should start with where we haven't been so successful. So when we look at the fragmentation between East and West, and if we think about, and Goolam mentioned China being a major consumer of pork and a major producer of pork, but in the last few years China had a number of outbreaks of swine fever, and they had to cull a huge part of their herd, their national herd. That should have given a country like ours an opportunity to export to China, given that there's this tension between East and West, and the other producers like America and Western Europe, I would think, don't have as good a relationship with the East as we might. Unfortunately, what is required in order to export to those countries is a protocol between our government and theirs, and our Department of Agriculture and theirs, and that is not in place. And despite efforts that have been made to the South African Pork Producers Organization, it's still not in place. So there was a massive opportunity which we couldn't take, which is a pity. That said, we have had some success in exporting into Africa. We've also, as you mentioned in the introduction, we've got a couple of pig farms in Namibia and a couple of abattoirs in Namibia, and we do export into a limited number of African countries. But that would be a significant opportunity for us going forward. Another consequence of recent socio-political developments has been, the war between Russia and Ukraine has been a major cause of disruption in feed markets, where both those countries are significant providers of feed, which is used in agriculture. So that significantly increased the price of feed for our pig farms. Again, I wish we could say, well, we're self-sufficient and we sorted that out ourselves. We do have some cropping, but not enough to be self-sufficient. So I can't say we fully successfully navigated that. We do some forward buying and do the best we can, but that is still a dynamic that we aren't fully in control of. What we have been successful in doing, though, is moving a little bit downstream from being just primary producers. So we have got our own abattoirs, which is a very key component of the next part of the supply chain. We have also got our own creameries that make butter and cheese, and therefore are also a provider of whey to us. So those are the kinds of things we've done. But as I said, we haven't solved all problems and been able to exploit all opportunities.
Thanks, Howard. In all this, how has the financial institution been able to support you in navigating the complexity?
So in much the same way as with Simon, I mentioned earlier the building of these large piggeries. When you build a large piggery, it costs hundreds of millions of rands, and certainly we wouldn't have been able to do that without the support of the banks. But over and above that, I've mentioned the significant and rapid escalation in feed prices. And that unfortunately coincided with a rapid reduction in pork prices. So you're in a tight cycle, and you do need support of the banks when you go through a tight cycle like that. So it's something that couldn't be properly navigated without support of your major financial partners.
Thank you. Let me pivot back to you, Bob. By the way, I think it was Farm Line. It was fascinating that 7 million farmers would speak to an AI. I found it fascinating. So I'm assuming that Driptech also has, given your leadership in innovative agricultural solutions, how has your company responded, and how are you looking to respond into the other markets given that your product is something that is really valuable across the African continent?
Zimbabwe is quite a unique country in that it's landlocked. We have massive agricultural potential, which has not been really harnessed at all. It's still there, ready to harness. So there's so much opportunity that exists in growing the agricultural industry and growing irrigation in the agricultural industry. We're well resourced with water. Not all of it's stored, but there'll be more dams that are going to be built, and they'll give the opportunity for more cropping and obviously more irrigation. On our blueberry project, which we started 5-6 years ago, we saw an opportunity there. It's an export crop, and the country is always short of foreign currency. We saw an opportunity there to create our own source of foreign currency because it's a fully exported crop. And more farmers are looking at those opportunities because the country is hampered by shortages of foreign currency, and the safest way to access foreign currency is actually to create it yourself through production, through farming practices. We also, the opportunity for us being landlocked and being far from supply markets is that the more bulky products like piping, water tanks, as I was speaking about, they're very expensive to move because you're essentially moving a lot of air. So we've taken the opportunity to manufacture those locally because we can be competitive in that area. Obviously, there's a lot of technology that's come into play in agriculture. We like to think that we're leaders in pursuing that technology, drip irrigation, micro irrigation, the methods of monitoring the type of soil moisture, the plant conditions, and be able to supply that information into the sector and give value to farmers in that regard. As I mentioned earlier, aligned with that, we have found other industries that are aligned in our business, which we've managed to focus on as well in the manufacturing sector, so that being solar energy, other farm products, wire and nails, fencing, these are all, they're related, and we're able to, under the same umbrella of the company overheads, be able to contain those businesses and be more efficient in doing so. I think that answered the question.
Thanks. So your thoughts on future technology advancements in your area, in agriculture?
What comes to mind, obviously, is AI. There's going to be a lot of access to that just from the peasant farmer, even being able to get information readily. Zimbabwe, in particular, is well covered with cell phone coverage. So there are opportunities, and I think the whole of Africa is in that situation. So I think there will be good feedback from that. I think appropriate technology is important. You've got to look at your target market, and most of our target market are fairly poor peasant-type farmers. So you need to look at the type of products that you have, that they're not out of range in price. Of course, they won't be the same quality, but they'll do the job. So drip tape, for example, you can go from 2 cents a meter to 30 cents a meter for drip tape, depending on the quality. And we're pretty careful to have both ranges of products available. Those for the professional type of farmers and those for the emerging farmers. So I think there's potential in that. I go back to solar again. It's going to play a pivotal role. It's a very high cost in the production of crops is power, electricity, especially if you're using irrigation. It's become more affordable. It's about half the price that it was 2 years ago, a solar system. So suddenly that technology has become available to Mr. Average. And it's a wonderful development. And I think it's going to revolutionize agriculture. We see peasant farmers, along with commercial farmers, employing this technology now. Drip, micro irrigation, solar, understanding nutrition and crop nutrition and water use more and more. And I think as time goes on, more and more farmers will be made aware of what's available to them and be able to make use of it. Obviously, this is where the banks come in. Everything requires a lot of capital to get started. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Bob. Before I come to you, Simon, I'll be giving the audience a few minutes to ask questions or make comments about how fragmentation has affected your business. So get the questions ready. I'll just take one or two questions. Simon, I'll tell you a bit of a story. Myself and Bill went to the central bank in Angola, and they were telling us that your company has been able to help the Angolan government save about $200 million from pasta importation. How have you been able to do this and drive pasta importation away from Angola? What competitive edge have you used? And then I go back to what Howard had talked about. I know you backward integrated. How has Russia, Ukraine war affected, your supplies and all that? It'd be good to tell that story.
So we started our construction of the plant when you visited in 2019. We started with one line. Now we have more than one line. And first we were trading the product. It's not a new product that we started immediately manufacturing. With that, the next step was to do, like I mentioned, vertical integration, produce our own flour, which is the raw material, 95% of the raw material for the pasta. And we have done that successfully with the support of Standard Bank. And now, which is the next stage, we are working with local farmers in growing some wheat. We have managed to secure, well, still little, 3% of our current production needs this year, but it's a start. And we continuously look to work towards to produce the pastas with locally produced raw material. This is to basically run away from the dependency on the needs of Forex, to have a more competitive advantage. I remember when the war between Russia and Ukraine started, the prices of wheat that we signed on a contract were, of course, cancelled, and the price increased 70% right after the war. So there's a lot of challenge. It was mentioned by you, Tunde, earlier that there's a lot of supply chain challenge, and we see that. So that's why we try to focus on the vertical integration, side by side, of course, on the diversification as well. Yeah. So that was the reason, one of the methods that we utilized to reduce the need of Forex, and I believe we will continue to reduce a lot more in the coming years with your support, of course. Yeah.
Thanks, Simon. Questions, comments from the audience?
Thank you. My name is Aditya Ram from Botha University. My question is really directed openly, but anybody who wants to pick it up can go ahead. While from an economics perspective, it makes the most sense to produce where it can be most efficiently and effectively produced, however, local governments wanting local resilience, where do we draw the line on that? And I'll give an example. I'm from Botswana. Botswana banned the imports of vegetables from South Africa, certain vegetables, to be able to develop a local farming sector. At the same time, it developed a very large citrus farm dedicated to its exports, and now we hear rumors of possible tons of citrus going to waste because South Africa won't allow it to cross its borders. This is totally against what we talk about with AFCTA and everything along the lines. So we talk one thing, but we're doing something completely separately. So where do we draw the line and how do we go forward? Thank you.
Anyone wants to take a stab at it? It's going to come to Goolam. But I'd like to. But let's hear from the.
I think production has to be merited on its on economics. You know, you need to research your markets and make sure that what you're going to grow is sustainable economically. I don't think you can rely on tariffs to protect your business and build a business based on that. And so, if you see there's a reliance on any one market, one needs to structure yourself so that if that market's not available to you, you know, you're still in business and you're not wholly and solely relying on that. You know, I know in our blueberry business we go to pains to make sure that we are well diversified in terms of our customer base. And I think, you know, if it pays to grow oranges in Botswana, then it's going to always be profitable. I don't think it's necessary to. One shouldn't be relying on one outlet in South Africa to expect them to take your crop off you. Because if South Africa runs into a problem with oversupply, obviously they're going to start trimming the smaller producers off. Yeah.
Thanks. Goolam, I think there's a fundamental point he's raising there, because there's a lot of tit for tat. You know, China, sure. US, it's not just South Africa, Botswana. You have all this going on, and yet we're talking about, so you talked about globalization, and then you coined a new word, slobalization or something like that. So what's your thoughts on this issue?
So just to be clear, I think when I talk about protection under the banner of giving thrust to infant industries, the capacity for industrialization to take root where you have comparative advantage. So not blanket. And comparative advantage comes in where, for example, you have an edge, an alpha, and maybe abundance of resources in a particular country is a comparative advantage. It could be that you have a large local market and production near that market, which is what typically is preferred, is a comparative advantage. And I concede, you know, Botswana has got a very, very puny population, about 2 million people. And so it's not a sizable domestic market, and exports is certainly an avenue for generating greater thrust to their economy, like Dubai city has done. So it's an industrialization strategy with respect to infant industry. It's not blanket, and it should be with respect to firms within the realm of comparative advantage. You know, to suggest over the last 30 years, for example, even in globalization and a world rules-based system, you know, China was incredibly protective. It used choice lending by state banks combined with low interest rates, and it was able to amass a manufacturing platform. In more recent years, again, choice lending, strategic industries, most notably electric vehicles, so much so that it is able to dwarf production elsewhere. If Tesla had started more recently, in the last year or two, I'm convinced Tesla would not have had the type of traction it had with the belated arrival of state-sponsored, I'm using that word liberally, electrical production out of China. So subsidies in crafty ways are a part of the global industrial base. Rule subversion is part of the game, so to speak, colloquially. I'm not suggesting that South Africa should lean, but I would, within that realm of crafty policymaking and execution, but I would be sympathetic to the notion that in the early 1990s, Alec Irwin perhaps maybe was a little too embracing of the liberalization of South Africa's industrial base too quickly, too soon, and it decimated, for example, our textile industry. So I think calculation, smart policy calculation, within an industry and comparative advantage framework should be the policy objective. And I could describe China as having operated within that realm. They've not necessarily had some elusive for rest of the nations greater level of ingredients in an open economy. And so there needs to be, as I've suggested, a craftiness and a wise policy-making process in tandem with industry. And I think that has been South Africa's shortcoming over the last 10 years or so at least, a lack of coherent policy-making, catchy area, but maybe black economic empowerment that is essential for South Africa's transformation, but weaponized for self-interest, elite interest, patronage interest, than necessarily wider shared interest. And maybe where we are now in terms of South Africa's political history, maybe where we are now, where Kenyan youth have put the politicians on notice with regard to executive excess, maybe the incremental nudge to a greater triumvirate of policy, politicians, and private sector. I always suggest growth is an incremental concept. So even if we're going to go from 0 to 0.5, that's something. That's directionally comfortable and something we can build on.
Thanks, Goolam. We've run out of time, so I'd first of all like to thank the panelists for taking our time to speak to us. Africa is our home. We drive our growth. In business and commercial banking, we turn possibilities to opportunities for the businesses that power Africa's growth. So these insights that you've given us will help us, support you more for the future. So thank you, and thank you for listening. Thank you very much. I hand over to Bongani.
Thank you very much, Tunde, and your panelists. And that brings us to the end of this session. We want to, of course, tell you now that we're going to split up and go for the lunch networking break. And after that, we've got two opportunities, and I think it's going to be really, really exciting. I'm going to be moderating a session on Africa's energy solutions. That will happen here. We've got session room 2 just across from where we are. And a former colleague of mine, we were both television anchors at the SABC. She's a renowned economics journalist. She's also a lawyer. I'm so pleased to tell you Nzinga Kunda is going to be joining us, and she'll be moderating that session called Trading as One. So that's what's going to happen after the lunch break. But for now, let's proceed to lunch, and bon appetit.